What happens when the Doomslayer, the ultimate demon hunter, is thrown into the world of My Hero Academia? In a society where heroes rely on quirks, fame, and strict rules, the arrival of a warrior who needs none of them is about to change everything. When the Doomslayer encounters a dangerous villain threatening innocent lives, he makes it clear that his methods are very different from those of the pro-heroes. But what happens when the hero society realizes that this mysterious warrior may be more dangerous than the villains he hunts? The Doomslayer has arrived in Musutafu, and the hunt has only just begun. The sky over Musutafu did not break with the grace of a summer storm, or the predictable shift of a weather pattern quirk. It fractured like stained glass under a sledgehammer. For a heartbeat, the vibrant, blue-skied afternoon of modern Japan was eclipsed by a vertical scar of jagged, screaming crimson, a rift that bled the smell of ancient ozone, scorched sulfur, and a rage so concentrated it made the air heavy enough to bruise. From this bleeding wound in reality, something fell. It did not tumble or drift. It plummeted with the intentional weight of a falling star, striking the asphalt of a narrow shopping district, with a kinetic force that shattered windows for 3 blocks. As the dust and pulverized concrete began to settle, the silence that followed was not the absence of sound, but a vacuum of terror. Amidst the colorful billboards and the gawking crowds of a society built on the polished image of pro-heroes, a silhouette stood. It was clad in armor the color of a bruised forest, forged from metals unknown to any terrestrial periodic table, and humming with the low-frequency thrum of argent energy, a power that felt less like a quirk and more like the heartbeat of a dying star. The Doomslayer did not look for a welcoming committee. He did not scan the horizon for a camera crew or a ranking of heroes. Behind the opaque, cold visor of the Praetor suit, eyes that had witnessed the collapse of dimensions and the literal burning of hells looked upon Musutafu and saw only a world of fragile glass. To the civilians, he was a nightmare made manifest, a mechanical titan of war. To the Slayer, the world was suddenly, jarringly quiet. But that quiet was broken by the familiar, wet sound of a predator. Down the street, past the screaming crowds, a corner of the district was engulfed in smoke and rising heat. The sludge villain, a grotesque mass of sentient pollution, had pinned a blonde teenager against a wall of fire. Pro-heroes, Death Arms, Backdraft, and Kamui Woods stood at the periphery, paralyzed not by a lack of will, but by the limitations of their own gifts. Their quirks were specialized tools, and in this specific moment, the tools did not fit the lock. They waited for someone with the right power, a specialist who could reach the boy without detonating the surrounding explosive runoff. They waited for a symbol. The Slayer did not wait. His first step forward cracked the pavement. He moved with a predatory economy of motion that defied his massive bulk, a blur of olive drab and steel that bypassed the police barricades before the officers could even register a breach. "Hey, civilian, stay back!" Death Arms shouted, reaching out a massive, muscled hand to intercept the stranger. The Slayer did not even break his stride. He simply moved through the hero's space. The contact was brief, a shoulder-to-shoulder brush, but Death Arms felt as though he had been hit by a runaway freight train made of solid iridium. The pro-hero was sent sprawling into a pile of industrial crates, his breath stolen by the sheer, unyielding density of the armored intruder. The sludge villain looked up, his lidless eyes widening within the muck. "Another one? You don't look like much of a hero. Just more meat for the gutter." The villain surged, a massive, oily tentacle of sludge whipping forward with enough force to decapitate a normal man. The Slayer caught it. He didn't dodge. He didn't use a quirk to negate the kinetic energy. He simply reached out a gauntleted hand and seized the liquid mass. The friction of the Praetor suit's grip, combined with the Slayer's impossible strength, treated the semi-liquid villain like solid cordage. With a guttural snarl that stayed trapped behind his helmet, the Slayer wrenched his arm back. The sludge villain was hauled forward, his entire 300-pound mass yanked through the air toward the armored warrior. In one fluid motion, the Slayer's left hand retracted, and the Doom Blade, a serrated, arm-mounted katar of tempered steel, snapped into place with a mechanical hiss. He didn't aim for a capture. He didn't look for a way to incapacitate. He saw a monster harming a child, and in the Slayer's cosmology, that equation had only one resolution. The blade sang as it cut. It didn't just slice through the sludge. The sheer speed of the strike created a vacuum pocket that tore the villain's molecular cohesion apart. The teenager, Katsuki Bakugo, was suddenly released, falling to the scorched ground and gasping for air, his eyes wide with a brand of shock he had never experienced. He looked up to see a titan standing over him, not with a smile of reassurance, but with the cold, indifferent posture of an executioner. The sludge villain tried to reform, his voice a gurgling shriek of agony. "My eye! You monster! I'll kill you!" The Slayer reached into the center of the villain's mass, his fingers sinking deep into the cold, viscous filth until they found the solid core, the villain's actual body hidden within the quirk-generated muck. He gripped the creature's jaw. The air grew hot. The smell of burning chemicals intensified as the Slayer's suit began to glow with a faint, ghostly green light. He wasn't just using muscle. He was an engine of pure, righteous wrath. "Stop!" Kamui Woods yelled, swinging forward on a strand of timber. "We don't kill. He's neutralized. Release him." The Slayer's head turned slightly. For a brief second, the pro-heroes saw their own reflections in the Slayer's visor, small, colorful, and utterly irrelevant. Then, with a sickening, wet crunch that echoed off the surrounding buildings, the Slayer closed his fist. He didn't just break the villain, he dismantled the threat with a finality that the Hero Public Safety Commission would later spend months trying to categorize. As the remains of the sludge villain slid into the gutters, no longer sentient, no longer a threat, the Slayer stood amidst the flames. He didn't look at the cameras, he didn't look at the boy he had just saved, he looked at his own hands, then up at the towering skyscrapers of Musutafu. He could feel it in the air. This world was different. It was soft. It was vibrant. It was full of heroes who played by rules of engagement and villains who treated cruelty like a career path. To the people of Musutafu, this was the day a new, terrifying vigilante appeared. To the Doomslayer, this was simply a new map, and there were always more demons to hunt, whether they wore horns or human skin. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. The road goes ever on. The Slayer turned his gaze toward a rooftop blocks away. There, leaning against a railing, a thin, sickly man with golden hair watched in absolute silence. Toshinori Yagi, the man the world knew as All Might, felt a shiver run down his spine that he hadn't felt since his first encounter with All for One. It wasn't just the violence, it was the presence. The stranger didn't feel like a human with a powerful quirk. He felt like an inevitability. He felt like the end of the era he had worked so hard to build. The Slayer's boots thudded against the pavement as he began to walk, not away from the scene, but toward the heart of the city. He ignored the sirens. He ignored the shouts of the heroes. He was the unchained predator, and he had smelled something in the wind of this new world, a scent of deep, systemic rot, and a shadowed laboratory miles underground. The hunt had begun. The cleanup of the Musutafu shopping district was usually a choreographed affair of municipal efficiency and hero-themed PR, but today, the routine was shattered. While paramedics tended to a shell-shocked Katsuki Bakugo and fire crews dampened the smoldering ruins of the alleyway, the police were not questioning witnesses about the villain. They were staring at the pavement. Where the armored stranger had walked, the reinforced concrete had cracked under a weight that defied the visual dimensions of his suit. There was no residue of a quirk, no elemental ice, no lingering gravity displacement, no chemical traces. There was only the faint, prickling sensation of static electricity that made the hair on the officer's arms stand up, and a scent like a lightning strike that refused to dissipate. 30 miles away, in the sterile, high-security heart of the Hero Public Safety Commission, HPSC headquarters, the silence was even more profound. On a wall of floor-to-ceiling monitors, the footage of the sludge incident played on a loop. The analysts had slowed the frame rate down to a 10,000th of a second, yet the strike of the arm-mounted blade remained a mere flicker of silver, a movement so fast it bypassed the human eye's ability to process motion. "Run the facial recognition again," a woman commanded, her voice cold and sharp as a scalpel. Mara, a high-ranking official, known for his perpetual exhaustion, shook his head, his eyes glued to the readout. "We've run it against every database on the planet, Madam President," Mara replied, rubbing his temples. "Not just Japan. We've checked the Quirk registry in the States, the European Union's Special Talents Archives, Even the black market DNA profiles from the underworld. Nothing. He doesn't exist. No birth certificate. No school records. No quirk factor medical history. From a bureaucratic standpoint, that man was born 5 minutes ago in the middle of a shopping mall. The president of the HPSC leaned forward, the glow of the screens reflecting in her spectacles. And the quirk analysis? What are we looking at? Kinetic enhancement? A self-contained pocket dimension in the armor? A lead researcher adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he pulled up a thermal scan of the Slayer's arrival. That's the problem. We've analyzed the thermal and radiation signatures from the impact site. There is no plus alpha element in his biology. Usually, when a quirk activates, we see a spike in certain neurotransmitters or a localized shift in body temperature. This thing, is emitting a form of energy we can't even categorize. It's highly concentrated, seemingly infinite, and it's not coming from his cells. It's being drawn from his equipment and his very soul, for lack of a better term. He isn't using a quirk. He's operating on a fundamental law of physics that we simply don't have a name for yet. While the authorities struggled to quantify the impossible was currently navigating the backstreets of Musutafu with the quiet focus of a mountain lion. The Doomslayer did not need a map. He had spent eons navigating the shifting, non-Euclidean labyrinths of the blood swamps and the jagged spires of Amora. A modern Japanese city was, by comparison, a simple grid, but he could feel the eyes, thousands of them. Not just from the people on the street who pulled their children away as he passed, but from the invisible network of the world itself. Cameras, drones, and the psychic hum of a society that was always watching, always judging. He paused in a shadowed park, the heavy thud of his boots stopping near a fountain, dedicated to a minor hero from decades past. He didn't sit. He didn't rest. He simply stood, a monument of scarred green steel, as the internal systems of the Praetor suit cycled through atmospheric data. The air was too clean. The people were too safe. It was a world that had forgotten the necessity of the blade, replacing it with the theater of the hero. "It's quite a heavy burden you carry, isn't it?" The voice was soft, wheezing, and lacked any predatory edge. The Slayer didn't reach for his combat shotgun, but his posture shifted, a subtle, microscopic tensing of the muscles that signaled he was ready to kill in less than a heartbeat. Standing 10 feet away was a man who looked like a gust of wind might shatter him. He was impossibly thin, his clothes hanging off a skeletal frame, and his eyes were sunken deep into shadow, save for 2 pinpricks of bright, piercing blue. Toshinori Yagi, the man who had been the symbol of peace for decades, coughed into a handkerchief, spotting it with blood. He didn't approach any closer. He knew better. He had spent his life staring down the most dangerous men on Earth, but the figure before him didn't feel like a man. "I saw what you did back there," Toshinori said, his voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and genuine curiosity. "You saved that boy. You did it faster than any pro could have. But you didn't just stop the villain. You ended him. Completely." The Slayer's visor remained fixed on the skeletal man. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence he projected was a physical weight, a demand for the point of the conversation. "In this world," Toshinori continued, his blue eyes searching the opaque visor for a glimmer of humanity, "we have rules, we have a code, we save people so they can see that tomorrow is better than today. But the way you fight, it doesn't leave room for a tomorrow for those you face. There was a purity in your anger, stranger. A purity I haven't seen in a long time. But there was no mercy. Not a drop." The Slayer finally moved. He took a single step toward Toshinori. To anyone else, it would have been a gesture of intimidation, but Toshinori stood his ground, even as his internal organs screamed in protest. The Slayer reached out, his massive armored gauntlet stopping inches from Toshinori's chest, right over the spot where the jagged purple scar of his old injury hid beneath his shirt. The Slayer knew. He had seen the wounds of the soul before. He recognized the smell of a warrior who was burning out his own life force to keep a flickering candle of hope alive. The Slayer retracted his hand, and, for the first time, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a gesture of friendship. It was the acknowledgement of one soldier to another who had been left behind in a war that never truly ended. Then, the Slayer turned and walked back into the shadows of the trees, his silhouette swallowed by the oncoming dusk. Toshinori stood alone by the fountain, his breath hitching. He realized he had been holding it the entire time. He reached up to his chest, his fingers trembling. "He didn't even use a quirk," Toshinori whispered to the empty air. He just looked through me. Deep in his gut, the symbol of peace felt a cold, oily dread. He had spent his career building a world where the law was the shield of the innocent, but he had just looked into the eyes of someone for whom the law was a luxury the universe couldn't afford. The Slayer hadn't come to Musutafu to be a hero. He hadn't come to be a villain. He was a reckoning. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows over the city, the HPSC issued its first classified directive regarding the entity they now officially designated as the Sentinel. The order was simple: observation only, do not engage, do not provoke. They didn't realize that the Slayer had already found what he was looking for. In the distance, hidden beneath the industrial ruins of the city's edge, a faint, rhythmic pulse of artificial malice was thumping, the heartbeat of something being grown in a vat, something that smelled of death and science. The League of Villains was preparing their first masterpiece, the Nomu, but the Slayer was already on the scent, and unlike the heroes of this world, he wouldn't be bringing handcuffs. The underworld of Musutafu did not exist in the light of the neon billboards, or the shadow of the great statues of All Might. It lived in the interstitial spaces, the abandoned subway tunnels, the windowless warehouses of the pier, and the fortified compounds of the Shie Hasaikai. In these places, the Hero Society was an abstract concept, a set of rules to be circumvented through the judicious use of trigger drugs and black market quirk support items. But for the small-time syndicates and the remnants of the Yakuza, the rules of the game had fundamentally changed overnight. Usually, a hero raid began with a megaphone warning, a flash of bright costumes, and a series of plus-ultra slogans meant to reassure the public while securing the suspects for the justice system. The Doomslayer did not use a megaphone. The warehouse on the edge of the Dagobah district was a hub for the distribution of quirk-enhancing toxins, guarded by men whose mutations made them living tanks. They were confident, armed with illegal military-grade hardware, and high on their own supply. That confidence lasted exactly until the reinforced steel bay door, designed to withstand a strike from a strength-type hero, was not breached, but disintegrated. A single blast from the super shotgun, amplified by the Praetor suit's internal argent conduits, turned the center of the door into a molten ring of shrapnel. The Slayer entered through the fire. He didn't look like a hero making an arrest. He looked like a natural disaster that had developed a personal grudge. A man with a kinetic absorption quirk lunged forward, his muscles bulging as he prepared to turn the Slayer's own momentum against him. The Slayer met him midair. He didn't punch. He simply caught the man's face in a gauntleted palm and hammered him into the concrete floor with such localized force that the shockwave shattered the ankles of the guards standing 10 feet away. There was no dialogue. There was only the rhythmic, mechanical ka-chunk of the shotgun cycling and the wet, visceral thud of a warrior who viewed the concept of mercy as a strategic failure. To the Slayer, these men were not villains in the theatrical sense. They were precursors. They were the rot that invited the swarm. In his long crusade, he had seen how the corruption of the soul led to the opening of the gates, and he treated the traffickers of Musutafu with the same uncompromising finality he had shown the acolytes of the Diog priests. Within 6 minutes, the warehouse was a tomb of silence, the only sound being the crackle of localized fires and the Slayer's heavy, regulated breathing. He moved to the back of the facility, his HUD highlighting a hidden basement level. There, he found the cages, not for criminals, but for those whose quirks were being harvested for the trigger serum. It was a sight that triggered a cold, ancient resonance in the Slayer's mind. He saw the same clinical cruelty he had witnessed in the UAC facilities on Mars. Life treated as a resource, suffering as a byproduct of progress. He was in the middle of tearing the bars off a reinforced cell when the temperature in the warehouse spiked by 40 degrees. "I don't know who gave you authorization to operate in this jurisdiction, vigilante, but your audition ends now." The voice was like the roar of a furnace. Standing in the jagged hole of the entrance was Endeavor. The number 2 hero was a pillar of incandescent rage, his beard and mustache of living flame flickering with a violent orange intensity. He didn't look at the carnage around him with horror. He looked at it with the annoyance of a professional whose record was being tarnished by an amateur's mess. "You've left 3 men in critical condition and destroyed millions in evidence," Endeavor barked, his eyes narrowing as he took in the Slayer's scarred armor. "The HPSC wants you brought in for questioning. I, however, want you off my streets. Stand down and submit to the restraints, or I will consider you a high-level villain threat." The Slayer didn't turn around immediately. He finished ripping the door from its hinges, gently ushering the terrified captives toward a rear exit. Only then did he turn his visor toward the flame hero. Endeavor was used to being the most intimidating man in any room. His quirk, Hellflame, was a manifestation of raw, destructive power that few dared to challenge. But as he stared at the green-armored silent giant, he felt an unfamiliar, instinctual prickle of alarm. The stranger wasn't tensed in a defensive posture. He was standing with the casual, terrifying balance of someone who had already calculated exactly how many seconds it would take to dismantle his opponent. "Nothing to say?" Endeavor sneered, his fist igniting into a brilliant, white-hot sphere of plasma. "Fine. I'll beat the identity out of you. Flashfire fist, jet burn." Endeavor propelled himself forward, a jet of flame erupting from his soles. He moved like a comet, his fist aimed directly at the Slayer's chest plate. It was a strike intended to end the fight instantly, to melt the armor and fuse the stranger to the floor. The Slayer didn't dodge, he dashed. The Praetor suit's lateral thrusters engaged with a sharp hiss of compressed air. In the blink of an eye, the Slayer wasn't in front of Endeavor. He was beside him. The Flame Hero's strike hit empty air, the heat of his fist scorching the concrete. Before Endeavor could recalibrate, a gauntlet caught him by the back of his flame-wreathed neck. The heat of Endeavor's quirk was staggering. Thousands of degrees of concentrated solar fury. To a normal man, or even a specialized hero, it would have been lethal. To the Doomslayer, who had waded through the literal lakes of fire in the seventh circle of hell and stood unfazed by the heat of argent-fueled crucibles, it was merely warm. The Slayer slammed Endeavor face first into a structural I-beam. The steel groaned, buckling under the impact. Endeavor roared, unleashing a 360-degree burst of fire that turned the interior of the warehouse into a kiln. You think you can mock me?" The Slayer emerged from the wall of fire, his armor glowing a dull, angry red from the heat, but otherwise completely intact. He didn't use a weapon. He didn't need one. He stepped into Endeavor's guard, his movements so fast they blurred. A hook to the ribs cracked the reinforced carbon fiber of Endeavor's suit. A palm strike to the chin sent the number 2 hero reeling, his flames flickering as his concentration wavered. The Slayer stopped. He could have ended it. He could have snap-kicked Endeavor through the warehouse wall, or used the Doomblade to find the gaps in the hero's defense. But he saw the look in Endeavor's eyes, the pride, the desperation to be seen as the greatest, the simmering resentment. He recognized the smell of a man who was fighting for his own ego, not for the lives in the cages behind them. The Slayer leaned in, his visor inches from Endeavor's scorched face. For the first time, a sound emerged from the helmet, a low, distorted growl that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. It wasn't a word, it was a judgment. With a shove that sent Endeavor tumbling back 20 feet, the Slayer turned and engaged his cloaking field, his form shimmering and vanishing into the smoke. Endeavor scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, his flames surging in a desperate attempt to find a target. "Get back here! I'm not finished with you!" But the warehouse was empty. Only the survivors remained, huddled in the back, watching the number 2 hero, with eyes full of fear, not for the villain they had been rescued from, but for the hero who had arrived too late and cared too much about his own standing. Endeavor stood in the ruins, his hands trembling. He had gone all out for a single moment, and the stranger had treated him like a nuisance. For the first time in his career, Enji Todoroki felt a cold, hollow realization. There was something in this world that his fire could not burn. And as the police sirens finally wailed in the distance, the Slayer was already moving toward the mountains, toward a scent of rot he had picked up during the fight. He had ignored the hero to focus on the hunt, because while the heroes of Musutafu fought for rank, the Doomslayer was fighting a war they didn't even know had started. The high-security faculty room of UA High School was a place usually reserved for curriculum planning and the delicate balancing of the country's most promising young legacies. Today, however, the air was thick with the scent of bitter tea and the heavy electric tension of a battlefield briefing. On the central holographic projector, a grainy high-speed recording of the warehouse incident played in a slow-motion loop. It showed Endeavor, the man who embodied the peak of quirk-based destructive power, being brushed aside like a bothersome insect by a blur of olive-drab steel. Shota Aizawa, known to the public as the underground hero Eraserhead, stood at the back of the room, his yellow sleeping bag discarded and his scarf-like binding cloth draped loosely over his shoulders. His bloodshot eyes were fixed on the Slayer's movements. As a man who relied on neutralizing the supernatural to level the playing field, Aizawa saw something in the Sentinel that disturbed him more than any villain he had ever faced. "He isn't using a quirk," Aizawa said, his voice a low, raspy monotone that cut through the murmurs of the other teachers. "I was watching the satellite feed from the HPSC during his scuffle with the Yakuza. I activated my quirk on him through the lens. A long shot, I know, but there was no connection. Nothing to erase. My eyes didn't even itch. You can't turn off what he is, because what he is isn't biological. It's fundamental. It's more than that, Shota," Principal Nezu piped up. The small, white, chimera-like creature sat atop a stack of folders, delicately sipping from a porcelain cup. His dark, bead-like eyes sparkled with a terrifying level of intelligence. "Look at the way he moves. He doesn't fight like a hero. A hero is taught to minimize damage, to prioritize the capture, and to project an image of stability. This individual operates on a philosophy of total erasure. He doesn't just stop the threat, he removes the threat's ability to exist in any future capacity." "He's a murderer," Vlad King growled, slamming a fist onto the table. "He left that warehouse looking like a slaughterhouse. If we allow someone like this to roam free, the entire foundation of the Hero Society collapses. We have laws for a reason. We have trials. We have the Quirk Regulation Acts." "And yet," Nezu countered, his voice disturbingly calm, "the crime rate in the Dagobah district has plummeted to 0 in the last 48 hours. The local gangs aren't just hiding, they are fleeing the city. They aren't afraid of being arrested. They are afraid of being hunted. There is a distinction, Sekijiro. One that the public is starting to notice." All Might, sitting in his diminished, skeletal form in the corner, remained silent. He remembered the feeling of the Slayer's hand near his scar, the way the armored giant had looked at him, not with awe, but with the weary respect of a veteran looking at a comrade who had stayed in the trenches too long. He knew what the others didn't. The Slayer wasn't a vigilante looking for fame, or a sociopath looking for a thrill. He was a specialist. "He is tracking something," All Might finally spoke, his voice thin but commanding. "He didn't stay to gloat over Endeavor. He didn't take the money or the trigger serum from that warehouse. He destroyed the laboratory and left. He's following a trail we can't see. While the educators of the next generation debated the ethics of his existence, the Doomslayer was miles away, deep within the mountainous forests that bordered the Musutafu prefecture. The Praetor suit's sensors were locked onto a specific frequency, a low-level radioactive hum mixed with the unmistakable pheromones of artificial decay. In the Slayer's HUD, the world was a map of heat signatures and tactical vectors, but the primary overlay was a pulsing, necrotic purple. He knew this scent. It wasn't the pure, sulfurous stench of the hells he had conquered, but it was a close cousin, the smell of life forced into shapes it was never meant to take. It was the smell of the Nomu. He moved through the dense foliage with a silence that seemed impossible for a being of his weight. Every few hundred yards he would pause, his gauntlet brushing against a tree trunk or a patch of soil. He was reading the environment, his suit's internal AI, Vega, processing the data at speeds that would have melted the supercomputers at UA. Slayer, the calm, synthesized voice of Vega, echoed within his helmet. "The biological signatures are intensifying. I am detecting a localized distortion in the spatial fabric approximately 3 kilometers ahead. It matches the profile of a warp gate quirk, though the energy output is being masked by high-frequency dampeners. The entities being cultivated here possess multi-source DNA. They are being engineered for one purpose: to kill the being known as All Might." The Slayer's grip tightened on the forend of the combat shotgun. To the heroes of this world, the Nomu were a scientific horror, a violation of human rights. To the Slayer, they were simply imps, made of meat and quirk factors instead of hellfire and spite. They were abominations, and the Slayer had a very specific way of dealing with abominations. He reached a clearing overlooking a massive, camouflaged concrete bunker built into the side of a ravine. This was one of the League of Villains' primary nursery facilities, a place where Dr. Garaki's twisted genius was given form. Even from this distance, the Slayer could hear the muffled rhythmic thumping of the life support vats, a heartbeat that sounded like a drum made of wet leather. He didn't call for backup. He didn't wait for a legal warrant. He reached onto his back and drew the plasma rifle. The weapon hummed to life, its internal cooling fans whirring as the blue energy cells began to glow. Back at UA, Nezu was looking at a map of the same mountain range. "I fear we are approaching a crossroads," the principal mused, looking at Aizawa. "Society has spent decades perfecting the standard of the hero. But the world is growing darker. All for One's shadow is lengthening. The question isn't whether the Sentinel is a hero or a villain. The question is, when the monsters finally come out of the dark, do we want a man who follows the rules, or a man who knows how to break the monsters?" Aizawa didn't answer. He just looked at the screen, where a satellite image showed a sudden, brilliant flash of blue light erupting from the mountainside. The Slayer had begun his breach. He didn't use the door. He used a heat blast from the plasma rifle to turn the reinforced concrete into molten slag, stepping into the facility as the alarms began to wail. Inside, the lights flickered red, reflecting off the green armor of the intruder. Before him stood rows of vats, each containing a hulking, brain-exposed nightmare. The first Nomu, a mid-tier model designed for regeneration, burst from its tank, its lidless eyes locking onto the Slayer with a mindless hunger. It let out a piercing, distorted shriek, its muscles bulging as it prepared to lunge. The Slayer didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his gun. He waited until the creature was mid-leap, then his hand shot out, catching the Nomu by its exposed brain. The sound of the grip was like a boot treading on dry sticks. To the League of Villains, this was their masterwork. To the Slayer, it was a Monday in the void. He wrenched his hand downward, slamming the creature into the floor with such force that the entire facility shuddered. The hunt wasn't just in the city anymore. The Slayer had found the source. And as he began the systematic decommissioning of the laboratory, the ripples of his actions were already heading toward the USJ. The timeline of the Hero Society was fracturing, and in its place, the symbol of doom was writing a new chapter in blood and spent casings. The Unforeseen Simulation Joint, USJ, was designed to be the ultimate proving ground for the next generation of heroes. A sprawling complex of artificial disasters where students could learn to save lives in the face of flood, fire, and collapse. But as the purple-black mist of Kurogiri's warp quirk expanded across the central plaza, the simulation became a tomb. Shota Aizawa was already a blur of motion, his binding cloth lashing out like a living serpent as he fought dozens of low-level thugs, but his eyes were fixed on the nightmare standing at the center of the plaza. It was a creature of charcoal gray muscle, its brain exposed to the air and its beak-like maw dripping with a corrosive saliva. This was the anti-symbol of peace, a Nomu specifically engineered to absorb the concentrated kinetic force of All Might's punches. Beside it stood Tomura Shigaraki, his face obscured by a severed hand, his scratching fingers drawing blood from his own neck. "Where is he?" Shigaraki rasped, his voice full of a childish, murderous petulance. "The symbol of peace is late for his own funeral. We went through all the trouble of inviting the NPCs, and the boss doesn't even show up? Nomu, kill the eraser. Let's see if the game gets more interesting once we start deleting the staff." The Nomu moved. It didn't run. It simply existed in a new location. Its speed so great that Aizawa's eyes couldn't track it. The pro-hero felt his arm snap before he could even activate his quirk. He was pinned to the concrete, the creature's massive hand crushing his skull into the pavement. The students of Class 1A, scattered across the various zones, watched in paralyzed horror. Midoriya, hidden in the bushes of the flood zone, felt a cold, leaden weight in his stomach. This wasn't a school exercise. This was an execution. But then, the air in the USJ didn't just vibrate. It screamed. High above the central dome, a spatial distortion rippled outward. It wasn't the smoky, controlled warp of Kurogiri. It was a jagged tear in the fabric of the dimension, a fracture that bled the orange-white light of a star going supernova. From this rift, a heavy metallic thud echoed through the chamber, followed by a sound that made the villains freeze in their tracks. The rhythmic, mechanical whine of a heavy weapon spooling up. The Slayer didn't descend. He arrived like a spear thrown from the heavens. He smashed into the plaza 30 feet from Shigaraki, the impact creating a crater that sent a shockwave through the artificial ruins. As the dust cleared, the students didn't see a hero in bright spandex. They saw a mountain of scarred green steel, bathed in the flickering glow of a plasma rifle's venting heat. The Slayer's visor was fixed on the Nomu. He didn't look at the injured Aizawa or the terrified children. He looked at the abomination, and the air around him began to warp from the sheer intensity of his argent-infused presence. What is that?" Shigaraki hissed, backing away as his instinct for self-preservation, honed by years of living in the shadows of All for One, screamed at him to flee. "That's not All Might. That's not a hero. Kurogiri! Is this a secret boss? Why wasn't he in the data?" "I do not know, Tomura Shigaraki," the warp gate responded, his misty form flickering. "I cannot sense a quirk factor. It is as if a hole in reality has taken a physical shape." The Nomu, sensing a threat that surpassed its primary directive, released Aizawa and turned toward the Slayer. It let out a shriek that shattered the nearby windows, its muscles bulging as it prepared to unleash a blow that could level a skyscraper. It lunged, a blur of gray death. The Slayer met the lunge with a blood punch. The gauntlet hit the Nomu's chest, and for a microsecond, the world seemed to stand still. The shock absorption quirk of the Nomu was designed to dissipate kinetic energy across its entire cellular structure, making it immune to physical trauma. But the Slayer's strike wasn't just physical. It was a release of stored argent energy, a metaphysical shockwave that didn't just hit the Nomu, it overloaded its biology. The ripple of the punch traveled through the creature's torso, and the students watched in stunned silence as the back of the Nomu's ribcage literally exploded outward in a spray of purple ichor. The creature was sent skittering back across the plaza, its chest a caved-in ruin, but its super regeneration kicked in instantly. The bone began to knit, the flesh stitching itself back together with a wet, nauseating sound. "It's no use," Shigaraki laughed, though his voice was thin and shaky. "My Nomu is invincible. You can hit it all you want, but it will just grow back. You're just a high-level mob. Nomu, kill him. Rip his head off." The Slayer didn't wait for the creature to finish healing. He reached onto his back and drew the ballista, a weapon that looked like an ancient crossbow forged in the heart of a forge world. The weapon hummed, its twin prongs glowing with a searing violet light as it drew power directly from the Slayer's Praetor suit. The Nomu lunged again, its regeneration nearly complete. The Slayer fired. A bolt of pure, condensed energy struck the Nomu mid-air. It didn't just penetrate, it detonated. The Destroyer Blade mod sliced through the creature's waist, severing the invincible beast in two. As the halves of the Nomu thudded to the ground, the Slayer was already moving. He didn't give it time to regenerate. He stepped over the upper torso, his boot crushing the creature's exposed brain into the concrete. Then, he drew the super shotgun. Click-clack. The sound of the barrels locking into place was the final period at the end of the Nomu's existence. The Slayer fired both barrels point-blank into the remains. The meat hook attached to the underbarrel launched, digging into the creature's primary heart valve and pulling the Slayer's next strike into the very center of its mass. He wasn't just killing it, he was erasing the possibility of its return. "Nomu? Nomu?" Shigaraki screamed, his voice cracking. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched to touch the Slayer, to decay the green armor, and turn the stranger into dust. "I'll kill you myself! I'll turn you into—" The Slayer's hand shot out, catching Shigaraki's wrist mid-air. The villain's 5 fingers touched the gauntlet. The decay quirk activated, a gray ripple of disintegration spreading across the metal. But it stopped. The Praetor suit, forged in the depths of the Sentinel realms and tempered by the energies of the divinity machine, was not made of matter that obeyed the laws of this universe's entropy. The metal did not crumble. It didn't even pit. The Slayer squeezed. The sound of Shigaraki's radius and ulna snapping was loud in the sudden silence of the USJ. The villain let out a pathetic, high-pitched wail as the Slayer lifted him off his feet by his shattered arm. Behind the visor, the Slayer's eyes were cold. He had seen gods more imposing than this boy, and he had broken them all. "Kurogiri, help me!" Shigaraki shrieked. The warp gate surged forward, attempting to envelop the Slayer and teleport his torso away from his legs. But the Slayer was faster. He released Shigaraki, spinning in a circle and drawing the combat shotgun. He fired a frag grenade from the secondary launcher directly into the center of Kurogiri's mist. The explosion disrupted the villain's physical anchor, the metal neck brace, sending the warp gate spiraling into a chaotic, unstable flicker. The Slayer stood at the center of the USJ, the remains of the invincible Nomu smoldering at his feet, the leaders of the League of Villains broken and retreating. He looked up at the observation deck, where the students of Class 1A stood, their faces a mask of awe and absolute terror. They had been told that heroes save people with a smile. Olba's leave. The man before them didn't smile. He didn't even breathe heavily. He was a force of nature that had arrived to tell the world that the game was over. And, as the heavy doors of the USJ finally burst open, revealing the silhouetted form of All Might, the symbol of peace didn't see a battlefield he needed to save. He saw a battlefield that had already been conquered. He saw the Slayer, standing amidst the ruins, and for the first time in his life, All Might felt redundant. The silence that followed the USJ incident was not the quiet of peace, but the bated breath of a society realizing its foundations had shifted. While the media focused on the miraculous survival of Class 1A and the mysterious armored savior, the Hero Public Safety Commission was busy scrubbing the internet of any footage that showed the Slayer's brutal efficiency. They wanted a narrative of heroics. The Slayer offered a narrative of extermination. But as the students of UA returned to their homes, the image of the green-clad Titan lingered in their minds, a stark contrast to the colorful, smiling idols they had grown up worshipping. For Midoriya, the Slayer was a terrifying enigma of power without a quirk. For Ida, he was a chaotic variable that ignored the law. For Bakugo, he was the first thing in the world he truly feared. Weeks later, the city of Hosu became the next stage for the collision of ideologies. The hero killer Stain had turned the narrow alleyways of the city into a killing floor, purging those he deemed fake heroes, those who fought for fame, money, or anything other than the pure ideal of sacrifice. To Chizome Akaguro, the world was a garden of weeds, and he was the scythe. But, on a night thick with the smell of ozone and the distant screams of a city under siege by second-generation Nomu, the scythe struck something it could not cut. Tenya Ida lay paralyzed on the damp pavement of a dead-end alley, the tip of Stain's jagged katana hovering inches from his throat. The hero killer's eyes, wide and manic, burned with a feverish conviction. "You are not a hero," Stain rasped, his voice a sandpaper growl. "You came here for vengeance, for your brother. You prioritize your own petty emotions over the duty of the shield. You are a cancer on this society, boy, and I am the cure." Before the blade could descend, a thud echoed from the rooftops above, a sound so heavy it felt like the heartbeat of the mountain. Stain spun, his reflexes honed by years of lethal combat, his blade whistling through the air. He expected a pro hero, perhaps Manuel or one of the local patrols. He found a nightmare. The Doomslayer stood at the entrance of the alley, silhouetted against the orange glow of the burning city behind him. He didn't say a word. He didn't offer a platitude about justice. He simply stepped forward, the heavy clatter of his boots drowning out the distant sirens. In his right hand, he carried the heavy cannon, its micro-missile rack already deployed and humming with a predatory readiness. Stain's grin widened, a grotesque expression of excitement. "I've heard of you. The Sentinel, the man who breaks the rules. They say you don't have a quirk. They say you fight with the rage of 1,000 demons." Stain shifted into a low crouch, his tongue flickering over his lips. "Are you a hero, stranger? Or are you just another beast dressed in steel, looking for a reason to kill?" The Slayer's response was a trigger pull. A micro-missile streaked through the narrow space, exploding against the brickwork just inches from Stain's head. The hero killer vanished in a blur of superhuman speed, leaping from wall to wall, with a grace that bordered on the supernatural. He was a master of the close-quarters ambush, relying on his blood-curdle quirk to end fights before they truly began. He only needed one drop of blood, one scratch. Stain lunged from the shadows, his serrated knife aiming for the gap in the Slayer's neck armor. "Show me your conviction," he shrieked. The Slayer didn't flinch. He dropped the cannon, the weapon hanging by its magnetic tether, and caught Stain's wrist mid-air. The impact was like a bird hitting a stone wall. Stain felt the bones in his forearm groan under a grip that felt less like a hand and more like a hydraulic press. He reacted instantly, spitting a concealed blade from his mouth, aiming for the Slayer's exposed chin. The Slayer tilted his head a fraction of an inch, the blade glancing off the reinforced polycarbonate of his visor, then he drove his knee into Stain's stomach. The air left the hero killer's lungs in a violent spray of bile. He was launched backward, tumbling across the wet trash and broken crates, but he scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with a new, terrifying realization. No, no, it's not rage, Stain whispered, coughing up blood. He looked at the Slayer, who was walking toward him with a terrifying mechanical rhythm. It's not just anger. There's no ego in you, no desire for recognition, no self at all. Stain had spent his life judging the souls of heroes. He could smell the pride on Endeavor, the doubt on the youngsters, the fading embers on All Might. But when he looked at the Slayer, he saw a void of pure, crystalline purpose. It was the ideal he had been searching for, but twisted into a form so absolute it was unrecognizable. The Slayer didn't want to be a hero. He didn't care about the heroic will. He was simply the end of the conversation. You, Stain laughed, a dry, hacking sound. You are what the world actually is. You're not a hero. You're the executioner of a godless universe. Stain lunged again, desperate now, throwing every blade in his arsenal. The Slayer swatted them aside with his gauntlets, each movement a masterpiece of combat efficiency. He closed the distance in a single explosive dash, his hands snapping out to seize Stain by his tattered scarf. He lifted the hero killer off the ground, pinning him against the cold brick wall. The doom blade hissed as it extended from the Slayer's arm, its edge glowing with a faint, thermal heat. Ida, still paralyzed on the ground, watched in a trance of horror and awe. He had wanted to kill Stain. He had wanted the hero killer to suffer, but seeing the Slayer, this silent, unyielding force, about to deliver judgment, made Ida realize the weight of what he had truly asked for. The Slayer didn't hate Stain. He didn't even acknowledge Stain's philosophy. To the Slayer, the hero killer was just another obstacle between him and the Nomu pulse he was tracking. The Slayer's visor remained inches from Stain's face. The hero killer didn't scream. He stared into the black glass, his eyes reflecting a man who had finally found the truth he was looking for, and realized it was his death. Do it, Stain rasped, a genuine smile of fanatical respect on his face. Be the monster they're too afraid to be. The Slayer's grip tightened. He looked past Stain, his sensors picking up the approach of pro-heroes. Gran Torino and Midoriya were closing in on the alleyway. He could feel the pulse of the city, the rules of this world, trying to assert themselves once again. He didn't kill Stain, not out of mercy, but out of a cold, tactical decision. A dead martyr was more dangerous to the stability of this world than a broken prisoner. With a move of casual, bone-breaking strength, the Slayer slammed Stain into the pavement, the impact shattering the villain's ribs and collarbone instantly. He didn't look back as he stepped over the unconscious hero killer and the paralyzed student. As Midoriya and Gran Torino burst into the alley, they found Ida weeping and Stain a mangled heap of flesh and rags. But the Slayer was already gone, his silhouette leaping across the rooftops toward the center of Hosu, where a winged Nomu was terrorizing the skyline. Midoriya looked at the broken ground where the Slayer had stood. He didn't even use a quirk, Izuku whispered, his notebook forgotten. He just decided the fight was over. In the distance, the Slayer drew his rocket launcher. He didn't care about Stain's judgment. He didn't care about Ida's vengeance. He was the Slayer, and in a city full of heroes and villains, he was the only one truly at war. The twilight over Musutafu was a bruised purple, the kind of evening that felt heavy with the transition from a day of order to a night of uncertainty. Following the events in Hosu, the Sentinel had become more than a mere curiosity for the Hero Public Safety Commission. He had become a theological crisis. On every news cycle, pundits debated whether the man in the green armor was a hero who did what was necessary, or a villain who simply hadn't found a reason to turn on the state yet. But away from the cameras, on a secluded observation deck atop one of UA High's satellite dormitories, the debate was far more personal. Toshinori Yagi stood by the railing, his oversized yellow suit fluttering in the cooling breeze. He looked smaller than he had even a week ago. The embers of One for All were cooling, the golden light of his prime flickering toward a final, inevitable dark. He knew his time as the symbol of peace was measured in months, perhaps weeks. Beside him, leaning against a reinforced concrete pylon, was the Doomslayer. The Praetor suit was covered in the fine gray dust of a dozen skirmishes with the League's scouts, its surfaces scarred but unyielding. The Slayer was cleaning the Doomblade with a piece of industrial cloth. He didn't look like a man resting. He looked like a machine during a maintenance cycle. "The students are talking about you," Toshinori said, his voice a dry wheeze. He didn't look at the Slayer. He kept his eyes on the city lights below. "Young Midoriya, he sees your strength, and he's afraid of what it means. Young Bakugo sees it, and he's angry that it exists without a name or a rank. You've disrupted the dream I spent 40 years building, stranger." The Slayer didn't stop his cleaning. The metallic rasp of the cloth against the serrated steel was the only reply for a long moment. "I built a world where a child can look at a hero and see a smile," Toshinori continued, his grip tightening on the railing. "I built a world where we don't have to be monsters to fight monsters. But you walk through this city like it's a graveyard. You look at our villains like they're already dead. I have to know, do you believe in peace, or do you just believe in the absence of things to kill?" The Slayer stopped. He retracted the doom blade into his gauntlet and turned his visor toward the skeletal man. To Toshinori, the black glass of the helmet felt like looking into a deep, ancient well. There was no malice there, but there was an absence of hope that was far more chilling. "Slayer," the voice of Vega resonated from the suit's external speakers, calibrated to a respectful, somber tone. "The individual Yagi Toshinori is inquiring about your prime directive. He seeks to reconcile your methodology with the preservation of his society's moral architecture." The Slayer stepped toward Toshinori. He was a head taller and twice as broad, a mountain of combat-tested lethality. He reached into a utility pouch on his thigh and pulled out a small, jagged piece of metal, a fragment of a Nomu's reinforced sternum he had kept from the USJ. He held it out to All Might. "This is what they are growing in the dark," the Slayer's voice finally emerged. It was a sound that didn't belong in a school or a city. It was a low, resonant rumble, heavy with the weight of eons spent in the vacuum of the void. It was the sound of a man who had forgotten how to speak of anything but war. "They do not care for your smiles. They do not care for your laws. They are the heralds of a hunger that does not end." Toshinori took the bone fragment. He could feel the residual heat of the Slayer's energy still humming within it. "I know they're dangerous. I know All for One is waiting. But if we become like you, if we discard mercy and the rule of law, then what is left to protect? If we rip and tear until there is nothing left but the survivors, have we really won?" The Slayer didn't answer with words. He walked to the edge of the roof and looked out toward the horizon, where the distant, jagged silhouette of the Tartarus prison sat on the ocean. He could sense it, the psychic pressure of All for One, a shadow that had survived for over a century by feeding on the very order Toshinori had cultivated. In the Slayer's mind, he saw the fall of Argent Denur. He saw the high priests who spoke of peace while the gates were being unlatched from the inside. He saw the cost of waiting for a legal solution while the demons were at the throat of the innocent. To the Slayer, All Might was a beautiful, tragic lie. A golden statue built on a foundation of shifting sand. "Peace is a luxury," the Slayer said, his voice echoing off the concrete. "I am the tax." He turned back to Toshinori. For a moment, the symbol of peace saw a flicker of something in the Slayer's posture. Not pity, but a profound, weary understanding. The Slayer knew that Toshinori was a hero. He knew that the man had given every drop of his blood to keep the darkness at bay. But the Slayer also knew that the darkness was no longer staying behind the door. "The boy," the Slayer said, referring to Midoriya. "He has the spark, but the spark needs a hearth, or it will just burn out in the wind. Teach him to save. I will teach the world what happens to those who make saving necessary." Suddenly, the Slayer's HUD flickered red. A high-frequency distress signal, encrypted and buried under layers of HPSC interference, pinged his internal sensors. It wasn't a call for heroes. It was a breach alarm from a secret research facility located beneath the ruins of the Camino district. The scent of Argent warped DNA, the signature of the high-end Nomu, was suddenly, violently present. The Slayer didn't wait for a farewell. He engaged his lateral thrusters, the blue flames of the Praetor suit illuminating the rooftop for a split second before he leaped. He cleared the 5-story drop with ease, hitting the ground in a 3-point landing that cracked the pavement, and vanished into the darkness of the forest surrounding UA. Toshinori stood alone on the roof, the jagged Nomu bone still in his hand. He looked at the spot where the Slayer had stood, then up at the stars. He felt a strange, cold clarity. The era of the symbol of peace was over. Not because he was losing his power, but because the world was no longer the kind of place that could be saved by a smile. God help us, Toshinori whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He's not here to join us. He's here to finish the war we were too afraid to start. As the Slayer raced toward Kamino, his mind was already a tactical map of destruction. He didn't care about the hero rankings or the opinions of the HPSC. He had found the scent of the master, the architect of the abominations. All for One was a name this world whispered in fear, but to the Doomslayer, he was just another tyrant sitting on a throne of meat, and the Slayer was coming to collect. The industrial heart of Kamino Ward was a labyrinth of rust, steam, and secrets. Deep beneath a seemingly mundane bottling plant, the air grew thick with the hum of high-voltage conduits and the sterile, metallic scent of a world where science had long ago abandoned ethics. The Doomslayer moved through the subterranean corridors not as an intruder, but as a predator reclaiming its territory. Every motion was silent, the Praetor suit's internal dampeners absorbing the heavy thud of his boots, while his HUD painted the dark hallways in a tactical spectrum of heat signatures and quirk energy outputs. He didn't need to be told who lived here. The psychic pressure was palpable, a cold, oily weight that sat at the base of the brain, the unmistakable aura of a man who had spent a century consuming the souls and gifts of others. The Slayer reached a vaulted chamber where the ceiling was lost in shadow, and the walls were lined with thousands of glass canisters containing quirk factor samples. At the center of the room, standing before a bank of monitors that flickered with data from across the globe, was a man in a tailored black suit. He wore no mask, yet he had no face. Only a mass of scar tissue that ended abruptly at his jawline, his breathing rhythmic and mechanical through a specialized life support system. All for One did not turn around. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the very image of a CEO of shadows. "It is a rare thing in this world to encounter a variable I did not account for," the Demon Lord said, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that carried the weight of a dozen different vocal cords he had stolen over the decades. "I have watched the footage from Musutafu, the USJ, and Hosu. I have consulted my doctors, my analysts, and my seers. We found no records, no lineage, no quirk." The Slayer didn't stop. He raised the heavy cannon, the targeting laser painting a crimson dot on the center of All for One's chest. "And yet, you possess a power that defies biological classification," All for One continued, finally turning to face the armored giant. He had no eyes, but he saw through a complex web of infrared and spatial vibration quirks. He saw the Slayer as a roaring furnace of white-hot energy, a sun trapped in a suit of green steel. "You are not a hero, and you are certainly not one of mine. You are an outsider, a stray god who has wandered into my garden." The Slayer pulled the trigger. The heavy cannon barked, a high-caliber round designed to penetrate the hide of a baron of hell screaming toward All for One's head. But the bullet didn't land. It stopped inches from the villain's face, caught in a shimmering, translucent wall of compressed air. "I have spent a lifetime collecting the impossible," All for One said, his hand extending. "I have taken the strength of giants, the speed of the wind, and the fire of the sun. But what you have, that shimmering golden fire within you, I have never tasted anything like it. It isn't a quirk. It is something older, something fundamental." The Slayer dashed, the Praetor suit's thrusters flaring as he closed the distance in a heartbeat. He swung a haymaker fueled by the suit's internal hydraulics, a blow that should have leveled the room. All for One didn't dodge. He activated a combination of impact recoil and force multiplication quirks. The collision of their fists created a shockwave that shattered the glass canisters for 50 feet in every direction, raining liquid DNA onto the floor. For the first time in a century, All for One felt his arm tremble. The strength of the man before him wasn't a biological multiplier, it was an absolute. "Give it to me," All for One hissed, his voice losing its calm veneer and replaced by a ravenous centuries-old greed. "I am All for One. Everything in this world belongs to me. Your strength, your armor, your very soul. I will add them to my collection." Dozens of black red-veined tendrils erupted from All for One's fingers, the forced quirk activation, and steel appendages. They lashed out with the speed of vipers, wrapping around the Slayer's arms, legs, and neck. They sought the gaps in the armor, the skin-to-skin contact required to initiate the transfer. The tendrils found purchase. All for One laughed. A hollow, rattling sound. Now, let us see what you are made of. The demon lord closed his eyes, his mind diving into the Slayer's spiritual architecture to begin the theft. He expected to find a quirk factor, a set of genetic instructions he could rewrite and consume. He expected to find memories of a life, a childhood, a home. Instead, All for One found the void. In the moment of connection, the demon lord's consciousness was dragged out of his own body and cast into the center of a screaming, eternal war. He didn't see the Slayer's life. He saw the destruction of entire galaxies. He saw the burning of Urdak, the collapse of the Sentinel worlds, and the endless, gore-soaked slaughter of 1 billion demons. He heard the music of the spheres, but it wasn't a song of peace. It was a rhythmic, pounding anthem of rip and tear. Then, he felt the fire. The Argent energy that powered the Slayer wasn't a resource to be taken. It was a divine wrath that consumed anything unworthy of its touch. All for One's steel quirk, a power that had never failed him, suddenly buckled. It was like trying to siphon the core of a sun through a straw. The energy backwashed into All for One's nervous system, a searing, white-hot agony that bypassed his pain nullification quirks. "No! What is this?" All for One shrieked, his physical body beginning to smoke as the Argent energy cooked him from the inside out. "There's nothing to take. It's all just rage. Get out of my head." The Slayer didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his gauntlet seizing All for One's face. He wasn't being robbed, he was being used as a conduit. Through the connection, the Slayer poured eons of accumulated suffering and righteous fury directly into the demon lord's mind. He showed the villain what immortality truly looked like, not the petty longevity of a man who stole lives, but the eternal, tireless duty of a man who could not die until all evil was extinguished. With a final guttural roar, the Slayer triggered a blood punch through the point of contact. The explosion was contained, a localized burst of kinetic and spiritual force that sent All for One flying backward. The demon lord crashed through 3 reinforced concrete walls, finally collapsing amidst the wreckage of a storage bay. His suit was rags. His life support mask was shattered. For the first time in his long, dark history, All for One felt a sensation he had forgotten. Absolute, paralyzing terror. The Slayer stood at the center of the ruined lab, his armor glowing with a dull, pulsating orange light. He didn't chase after the fallen villain. He didn't need to. He had seen into All for One's mind, and he had found the coordinates for the main Nomu production facility in Camino. The demon lord was broken, his mind fractured by the sheer scale of the Slayer's existence. You are not a man." All for One wheezed from the rubble, his voice a pathetic shadow of its former glory. "You are a curse, a plague sent to end us all." The Slayer didn't look back. He reloaded the super shotgun, the twin barrels clicking into place, with a sound that felt like a death knell for the era of villains. He hadn't just defeated All for One, he had invalidated him. The demon lord of the underworld was just another pretender, and the Slayer had work to do. The true siege of Camino was about to begin, and as the Slayer stepped back into the shadows of the tunnels, he wasn't alone. He could feel the eyes of the Valar and the ghosts of the Night Sentinels watching. This wasn't a hero's raid. This was a crusade. The air over Camino Ward was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy metallic tang of industrial runoff. To the residents, it was just another humid evening in the shadow of the factories. But to the professional heroes moving in the dark, it was the precipice of a war. Volmite, Endeavor, Best Jeanist, and a dozen other top-tier pros had surrounded the League's hidden warehouse, their plan a surgical strike to rescue Bakugo and dismantle the villainous core. They moved with the grace of a practiced machine, communicating in whispers, waiting for the signal to execute a perfect, law-abiding containment. The Doomslayer did not whisper. He did not wait for a signal. A mile from the warehouse, the Slayer stood atop a rusted water tower, his visor locked on the building. His sensors didn't just see the structural weaknesses, they saw the surging, erratic energy of the warp gate and the necrotic signatures of at least 20 high-end Nomu being primed for deployment. To the heroes, this was a hostage situation. To the Slayer, it was a nest. And in the manual of the Night Sentinels, you do not negotiate with a nest, you incinerate it. He reached for the chaingun. The weapon was a marvel of lost Earth engineering and argent-tempered steel. its 4 barrels clicking into place as the mobile turret modification deployed. The Slayer didn't descend the tower, he ran off the edge, his lateral thrusters firing to accelerate his descent into a horizontal streak of fire. He struck the warehouse roof like a kinetic bombardment, the concrete and steel joist buckling instantly. Inside, the League of Villains was in the middle of a strategic debate. Shigaraki, his arm still in a cast from the USJ, was ranting about the player who cheated, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. Bakugo, chained to a chair of reinforced steel, was snarling insults at Twice and Toga. The arrival of the Slayer turned the room into a whirlwind of debris and thunder. The Slayer didn't land on his feet. He landed in a dash, his momentum carrying him through the interior office walls. Before the villains could even register the breach, the chain gun began to scream. A wall of lead and argent-heated slugs tore through the room, not aimed at the people, but at the structural supports and the hidden vats beneath the floor. The Slayer was deconstructing the fortress from the inside out. "It's him! The cheat code!" Shigaraki shrieked, diving behind a lead-lined counter. "Nomu! Forget the heroes! Kill the green one! Kill him now!" From the shadows of the warehouse's lower level, the high-ends emerged. These weren't the mindless drones from the USJ. They were intelligent, capable of speech, and possessed multiple top-tier quirks. One, a spindly creature with 6 arms and jet propulsion legs, hissed as it lunged, its claws glowing with a thermal decay quirk. The Slayer met the charge by switching to the rocket launcher. He didn't fire at the creature, he fired at the floor beneath it. The remote detonation triggered mid-air, the explosion staggering the Nomu. In the split second of its disorientation, the Slayer was on it. He didn't use a gun. He used his hands. He seized the creature by its elongated jaw and its primary shoulder joint. With a sound like a ship's hull tearing in a storm, he performed a glory kill, the sheer, divine strength of the Slayer overcoming the Nomu's reinforced biology. Outside, the heroes were frozen. "What was that explosion?" Best Jeanist shouted, his hands weaving threads of steel cable to contain the perimeter. "We haven't given the order. Is it All Might?" "No," Endeavor growled, his flames erupting in a violent surge as he saw the warehouse roof begin to glow with a sickly violet light. "It's the Sentinel. He's already inside." All Might lunged forward, his muscular form a blur of speed as he crashed through the main doors. "Everyone, stay back! The symbol of peace stopped dead. The interior of the warehouse was a vision of a hellscape. The Slayer was at the center of a literal mountain of charcoal gray meat, his armor slick with purple ichor. He was currently holding a high-end Nomu by its throat, using it as a living shield against a barrage of compressed air blasts from another. The Slayer looked at All Might, not with a plea for help, but with a warning. "Get the boy and leave," the Slayer's voice rumbled through the chaos, a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated in the marrow of All Might's bones. "I can't do that," All Might roared, leaping toward Bakugo's chains. "We don't leave people behind, and we don't turn a rescue into a massacre." "This is not a rescue," the Slayer replied, his arm-mounted blade snapping out and decapitating a third Nomu in a single, fluid horizontal sweep. "This is a sterilization." The warehouse began to vibrate with a new, terrifying frequency. From the shadows of the rear loading dock, All for One appeared, his hands raised. He had recovered, his body stitched back together by a dozen regenerative quirks, his presence more suffocating than ever. He didn't look at All Might. He looked at the Slayer. "You have cost me a great deal, stranger," All for One said, his voice echoing through the ruined chamber. "My labs, my masterpieces, my anonymity. But here, in the dark, I have no need for rules. If you wish to fight like a god, then die like one." All for One unleashed a combination quirk, spring-like limbs, multi-giant, and kinetic booster. A forest of black, obsidian-hard tendrils exploded from the floor, each one aimed at the Slayer's vitals. At the same moment, Kurogiri's warp gates opened everywhere, attempting to scatter the heroes and the Slayer into the path of the high-ends. The Slayer didn't retreat. He reached for the crucible. The hilt ignited with a hum that drowned out the sirens and the screams. A blade of pure, unadulterated argent energy, red as a dying sun, erupted into existence. The air in the warehouse didn't just get hot, it became holy. The presence of the crucible reacted with the quirks in the room, the ancient, divine energy of the Night Sentinels refusing to be governed by the laws of biological mutation. The Slayer swung. The red blade sliced through All for One's obsidian tendrils, as if they were wet paper. He moved with a speed that even All Might couldn't track, a whirlwind of red light and green steel that turned the warehouse into a slaughterhouse of the supernatural. "Bakugo! Move!" Midoriya screamed, having breached the perimeter with Todoroki and Kirishima. They saw the Slayer carve a high end in half with a single stroke of the red blade, the cauterized edges of the creature's flesh, glowing with a fire that refused to go out. The Slayer stood between the children and the Demon Lord. He was the wall, he was the fire, he was the end of the line. All for One unleashed a blast of concentrated energy that leveled the remaining walls of the warehouse, but the Slayer didn't move an inch. He stood his ground, the crucible held high, the reflection of the red blade dancing in his visor. The heroes saw a man who had lost his humanity to save the world. The villains saw a hunter who would never stop. And as the dust cleared, revealing the ruined remains of the Camino district, the Slayer took a step toward All for One. The siege was over. The execution was beginning. The final moments of the Camino siege were not recorded by news helicopters or captured by the frantic cell phones of fleeing civilians. The atmospheric pressure within the ruins of the bottling plant had reached a critical threshold, where the raw, celestial energy of the crucible met the accumulated, stolen malice of 100 different quirks. The resulting interference created a dead zone of static and roaring wind that cut the world in two. On one side stood the Hero Society, battered, gasping, and clutching to the ruins of their symbol. On the other side stood the Doomslayer, a monolith of green steel and red flame, representing a reality that did not care if they were ready for it. All for One was no longer a man. He was a desperate, pulsing amalgamation of every violent impulse he had ever harvested. His right arm had morphed into a jagged, multi-ton girder of bone and pressurized muscle, reinforced by spear-like bones and hypertrophy. He swung at the Slayer with a force that had once leveled city blocks, a strike that moved faster than the sound of its own execution. The Slayer didn't dodge. He moved into the strike, the crucible leading the way. The red blade of the Sentinel sword didn't just cut, it cauterized the very essence of the attack. As the energy blade made contact with All for One's mutated limb, the stolen quirks within the flesh screamed. It was a metaphysical rejection. The Argent energy acted as a caustic agent against the unnatural fusion of All for One's biology. The massive arm didn't just fall, it dissolved into ash mid-swing, the red fire of the crucible, chasing the corruption back toward the Demon Lord's torso. You are a void!" All for One shrieked, his voice distorted by a dozen different vocal cords failing at once. "There is no justice in you! No light! You are just a walking grave." The Slayer's response was a sudden, violent forward dash. He bypassed the Demon Lord's defenses and seized the villain by the throat. Behind the visor, the Slayer's eyes were not filled with the theatrical hatred of a hero, but the cold, industrial focus of a man finishing a job. He didn't want a confession. He didn't want a trial. He wanted the cycle to stop. With a roar that shook the remaining foundations of the ward, All Might lunged forward, his final embers of One for All flaring into a blinding golden aura. "Slayer, stop! If you kill him like this, you destroy everything we stand for. You prove that strength is the only law." The Slayer paused. He held the gasping, broken form of the world's greatest villain in one hand and the humming crucible in the other. He looked at All Might, then at the young Midoriya, who was watching from the periphery, with eyes full of tears and terror. He saw the hope they were trying to protect. He saw the fragile, beautiful lie that a world of monsters could be governed by the hearts of men. Then, he looked at the shadows beneath the ruins, the secret vats, the thousands of lives All for One had already consumed, and the inevitable return of the darkness if the root was not pulled. The Slayer retracted the crucible. For a heartbeat, All Might felt a surge of relief. But then, the Slayer's gauntlet tightened. He didn't use the sword. He used the blood swell. He channeled the sheer, unadulterated weight of his own soul. The soul that had been tempered in the divinity machine and hardened by eons of crusade, directly into All for One. It wasn't a physical strike. It was a spiritual eviction. The Slayer wasn't killing the man. He was burning out the All for One quirk itself. The scream that erupted from the demon lord was not human. It was the sound of a century of stolen power being forcibly disconnected from its host. The black tendrils of the villain's essence withered and turned to gray dust, evaporating into the night air as the Slayer purged the corruption with a purity of will that no quirk could match. When the Slayer finally released him, the man who had been the demon lord of the underworld collapsed into a heap of withered, powerless skin. He was alive, but the All-for-One was gone, not stolen, but annihilated. The Slayer had done what no hero could. He had removed the threat without becoming the very thing he hunted. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining high-end Nomu, deprived of their master's psychic tether, slumped into catatonic heaps, or fled into the night, their artificial minds broken. The heroes moved in to secure the area, their movements hesitant, their eyes constantly flicking back to the armored giant standing in the center of the crater. The Slayer didn't wait for the handcuffs. He didn't wait for the gratitude of the students, or the condemnation of the commission. He turned toward the dark mountains in the distance. His HUD was already scrolling with new data. The League was scattered, but the scent of the source, the original dimension tier that had brought him here, was still pulsing. There were more labs, more abominations, and somewhere, hidden in the folds of this world's reality, something was laughing. The Slayer engaged his cloaking field. His form shimmered, the green steel turning to glass, then to nothing at all. "Wait!" Midoriya cried out, taking a step into the crater. "Who are you? Why did you save us?" There was no answer from the wind, only the faint, fading sound of a mechanical heavy weapon cycling, and the smell of ozone that refused to dissipate. The Battle of Kamino was over. The symbol of peace had been saved, but the era of heroes had been fundamentally altered. The world now knew that there was a ceiling to their power, and that beyond that ceiling, something far older and far more dangerous was watching. The Slayer was still out there, a shadow in the periphery of their society, a symbol of doom that stood as a silent guardian against the things that smiles could not stop. Conclusion. The morning following the Camino incident rose over a Japan that felt fundamentally different. The news was a chaotic storm of the Sentinel's image and the miraculous, if brutal, end of All-for-One's reign. All Might's retirement was official. His golden light faded to a noble, quiet ember. But the vacuum he left was not filled by Endeavor or any other ranking hero. It was filled by a question. The Doomslayer remained in the shadows, a ghost story whispered by villains and a cautionary tale studied by the HPSC. He had not joined the faculty of UA, nor had he signed a contract with the government. He was a force of nature, moving through the underworld like a forest fire, leaving only ash and empty cages in his wake. Midoriya sat on the beach of Dagobah, looking at his hands. He still held the flame of One for All, but he no longer looked at the world through the lens of a comic book. He understood now that there were wars that did not end with a handshake. He looked at the horizon, where the sun was hitting the water, and for a moment, he thought he saw a glint of green steel in the distant trees. The Slayer was still hunting. The doom of the world had arrived, but for the first time, the darkness was the one that was afraid. The hunt was not over. It had only just begun.